It was one of those calm nights. Victor, my husband, was fast asleep in the bedroom. He'd had a long day at work and, as usual, fell asleep quickly, leaving me to myself in the living room. I didn't mind. I liked having a little time to relax before bed. The TV was on, but I wasn't really paying attention. I kept flipping through the channels, trying to find something interesting, but nothing caught my eye. The house was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I took a deep breath, feeling grateful for the quiet. Little did I know, that peace was about to be shattered. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I frowned and glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. Who could be knocking at this hour? For a second, I thought about ignoring it, but then the knock came again, louder this time. Curiosity got the best of me, so I got up from the couch and walked to the door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw our neighbor, James, standing there. He lived a couple of doors down and had visited a few times, usually when my husband was around. But it was strange for him to come over so late. I opened the door slightly, giving him a small smile. "James, is everything okay?" He smiled back, but something was different about the way he looked at me tonight. It made me feel uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. "Hey, Grace," he said in a friendly tone. "I'm really sorry to bother you this late, but I ran out of gas. Do you have any I can borrow?" I was in the middle of baking something. Baking at this hour? I thought to myself. But I didn't want to be rude. "Sure," I said, stepping back to let him in. James followed me inside, and I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. It made me uncomfortable, but I told myself I was just imagining things. He was our neighbor, after all. Nothing could be wrong with him just asking for gas, right? As I reached for the gas can in the kitchen, I heard James's footsteps behind me. He wasn't standing in the doorway like I thought he would be. Instead, he was right there, too close. "You look really nice tonight, Grace," he said, his voice lower than usual. My hand froze, and my heart started beating faster. Something wasn't right. I tried to laugh it off, keeping my back to him. "Thanks, James." "Here's the gas," I said, holding it out to him without turning around. But instead of taking it and leaving, James stepped closer. I could feel the heat of his body behind me, and I froze. My mind was racing. Victor was just in the next room, asleep. All I had to do was shout, and he'd come. But for some reason, I couldn't move. "James," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice calm. "I think you should go." James didn't leave. Instead, he reached out and gently touched my arm. The room felt like it had stopped moving, and my stomach churned. "I've always thought you were beautiful, Grace," he whispered. In that moment, fear washed over me. This wasn't just a friendly neighbor anymore, this was something else. Something dangerous. I knew I had to get him out of the house, and fast. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pulled my arm away from James and stepped back, putting the kitchen counter between us. "James, stop," I said, louder and more firm this time. "You need to leave. Now." For a moment, James just stood there, staring at me like he couldn't believe what I had said. Then his expression changed. His smile faded, replaced by something darker. His eyes narrowed, and he stepped toward me again. "You don't know what you're missing, Grace," he muttered, his voice cold. I felt my skin crawl. I was about to shout for Victor when James finally turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I stayed where I was, frozen in place, until I heard the front door slam shut. When I was sure he was gone, I sank to the floor, trembling. What just happened? How could someone we trusted act like that? I felt sick, like the whole world had shifted around me. Victor was still asleep, completely unaware of what had just happened. Part of me wanted to wake him up and tell him everything, but another part of me felt ashamed. How could I let something like this happen? Maybe it was my fault. Maybe I should have stopped it sooner. But deep down, I knew the truth, it wasn't my fault. James had crossed a line, and nothing I did made that okay. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time, trying to calm myself down. Eventually, I got up, locked the door, and went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw James's face, heard his voice, and felt his hand on my arm. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. Something had to be done. The next morning, Victor noticed right away that something was wrong. I hadn't slept much, and it showed. Over breakfast, he kept glancing at me, his brow furrowed with concern. "Grace, you seem off today," he said, setting his coffee down. "Did something happen?" I hesitated, playing with the spoon in my cereal. This was the moment of truth. If I told Victor what had happened, things would never be the same. But I couldn't keep it a secret any longer, he had to know. "Victor," I began, my voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." He put his cup down, his full attention now on me. "What is it?" I took a deep breath and told him everything, about James coming over, asking for gas, and how he had made a move on me while Victor was asleep in the next room. As I spoke, Victor's face changed. At first, he looked confused, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then his confusion turned to anger. "He did what?" Victor asked, his voice tight with rage. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. He touched my arm and said things that made me really uncomfortable. I told him to leave, and he did, but I don't know what to do now. Victor stood up, pacing the kitchen. His fists were clenched, and I could see the anger building inside him. "I'm going to talk to him," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm not going to let him get away with this." "Victor, wait," I said quickly, standing up and grabbing his arm. "Please don't make a scene. I don't want things to get worse." Victor looked at me, his eyes still blazing with anger. "Grace, he disrespected you. He disrespected us. I can't just let that slide." "I know," I said softly. "But I don't want to cause more trouble. I just want to handle this quietly." Victor sighed, his shoulders slumping as he pulled me into a hug. "We'll figure this out," he whispered. "Together." Over the next few weeks, things were tense. Every time I saw James outside, my heart would race, and I'd quickly look away. He acted like nothing had happened, smiling and waving at us like he always did. But I knew the truth, and that truth weighed on me like a heavy stone. Victor was still angry, but he respected my wishes and didn't confront James. Instead, we kept our distance, avoiding any unnecessary contact with him. The tension between us and James was thick, like an invisible wall separating us. Even though we stayed quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to do something more. What if James tried this with someone else? What if he crossed the line again with another woman who couldn't push him away? The thought made my stomach churn. Staying silent wasn't enough. I had to speak up, not just for myself, but for anyone else he might hurt. One evening, I decided to talk to Precious, James's wife. Precious was a sweet woman who had always been kind to me. She had no idea what kind of man her husband really was, and I felt sick thinking about it. She deserved to know the truth, even if it was painful. I invited Precious over for coffee, and as we sat in the living room, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. How was I going to tell her that her husband had made a move on me while my husband slept just a few feet away? "Precious," I began, my voice shaking, "there's something I need to tell you about James." Precious looked at me with concern, setting her coffee cup down. "What is it, Grace? You seem upset." I took a deep breath and told her everything. As I spoke, I watched the color drain from her face. At first, she looked shocked, unable to believe what I was saying. But then, slowly, realization dawned on her. As I continued speaking, Precious's expression shifted from shock to quiet sadness. She clasped her hands together tightly, her knuckles turning white. I could tell she was struggling to process what I had just told her. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't believe James would do something like that." "I'm so sorry, Precious," I said softly, reaching out to touch her hand. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I felt like you deserved to know the truth." He made me really uncomfortable, and I just couldn't stay silent. Precious nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I'm glad you told me, Grace. How could I have been so blind? I never imagined he would." Her voice trailed off, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. I felt terrible seeing her so broken, but I knew this conversation needed to happen. Precious deserved the truth, no matter how much it hurt. After a few moments, Precious lifted her head and wiped her tears. She looked at me with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Thank you for telling me, Grace," she said, her voice steadier now. "I need to confront him about this. I need to know why he would do such a thing." I nodded, understanding the weight of the decision she was about to make. "If you need anything, Precious, I'm here for you. You don't have to go through this alone." She smiled weakly, grateful for my support. "I appreciate that," she said. I need to figure out what to do next." As Precious left my house, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't easy telling her the truth, but now that it was out in the open, I knew it was the right thing to do. What James had done wasn't just a mistake, it was a breach of trust. Staying silent would have allowed him to continue hurting others. The next day, Victor and I were sitting in the kitchen, drinking our morning coffee, when we heard loud voices outside. I glanced out the window and saw Precious standing in front of her house, shouting at James. It was clear she had confronted him about what I had told her, and things weren't going well. James's face was red with anger, and he was gesturing wildly, trying to defend himself. But Precious wasn't having it. Her voice was strong, and even from inside our house, I could hear the hurt in her words. "You crossed a line, James," she shouted. "How could you do this to Grace? How could you do this to me? After all these years, this is how you repay our marriage?" James looked around, noticing that neighbors were beginning to peek out of their windows. His face twisted into a scowl as he grabbed Precious's arm, trying to pull her back inside. "Precious, stop this," he hissed. "You're making a scene." But Precious shook him off, her voice even louder. "I don't care. Everyone should know what kind of man you are. You disrespected our marriage, and you disrespected Grace." By now, a few of our neighbors had stepped outside, watching the scene unfold. I could see the shame on James's face as he realized how public this had become. He muttered something under his breath and stormed back inside, leaving Precious standing alone in the front yard, tears streaming down her face. I felt a mixture of emotions as I watched. Part of me was glad that James's actions were finally out in the open. But another part of me felt heartbroken for Precious. She didn't deserve this pain, no one did. Victor stood up, setting his coffee cup down with a heavy sigh. "I guess it's over now," he said softly. I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Things would never be the same again, for any of us. Over the next few weeks, things were tense between us and James's family. Precious eventually moved out, taking her children with her. I saw her a few times after that, and each time, she looked a little stronger. She was starting to rebuild her life, away from the man who had hurt her. James kept a low profile after the confrontation. He avoided eye contact whenever we passed by and stopped coming around altogether. It was as if he had disappeared from our lives completely, and honestly, I was glad for it. But even though James was out of the picture, the impact of what had happened stayed with me. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, replaying the events in my mind. I kept thinking about how easily things could have gone wrong, how different my life could have been if I hadn't stood up for myself. One evening, Victor and I were sitting on the porch. "You know," Victor said, breaking the silence, "I'm really proud of you." I looked at him, surprised. "Proud of me? For what?" "For standing up for yourself," he said, his voice gentle. "You didn't let James intimidate you. You could have stayed quiet, but you didn't. You did the right thing." I smiled, feeling a sense of warmth wash over me. It wasn't easy, I admitted. But I knew I couldn't let him get away with it, not just for me, but for Precious too. And for anyone else he might have hurt. Victor nodded, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "You're stronger than you realize, Grace. And I'm so lucky to have you." We sat there for a while, watching the stars. In that moment, I realized that even though the experience had been painful, it had also taught me something important. I had learned the power of standing up for myself, even when it was difficult. I had learned that silence only allows wrong to continue, and that speaking up, no matter how scary, can make a difference. Most importantly, I had learned that no matter what life throws at us, we can always find strength in ourselves and in the people who love us. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. Victor and I continued to strengthen our relationship, and I felt more confident in myself than ever. James eventually moved out of the neighborhood, and we never saw him again. His departure left a strange sense of closure, though I knew healing would take time for everyone involved. One day, I received a letter from Precious. She had moved to a different city and was starting over with her kids. In her letter, she thanked me for telling her the truth, even though it had been painful. "Your courage gave me the strength to make the hardest decision of my life," Precious wrote. "Thank you, Grace, for showing me that sometimes the truth, no matter how difficult, is what sets us free." I smiled as I read her words, feeling a sense of peace. Precious was right. The truth had been hard to face, but it had also brought freedom, not just for her, but for me as well. In the end, this experience taught me that we all have the power to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's scary. Speaking up is the first step toward healing and justice. And no matter how dark things may seem, there is always light at the end of the tunnel. The moral of this story is clear: silence can often be the worst form of betrayal. When someone crosses a line, we must find the courage to speak up, not just for ourselves, but for others who might be affected. By standing up for what is right, we protect not only our dignity but also the dignity of others. And in doing so, we pave the way for healing and new beginnings. Life went on, but the lessons stayed with me. The strength I discovered during those difficult times became a part of who I was, shaping how I approached challenges and relationships in the future. Victor and I grew closer through it all, our bond stronger than ever, built on mutual respect and unwavering support. As for Precious, her journey became a testament to resilience. In her occasional letters, she shared updates about her new life, a new job, her children thriving in school, and the peace she was finally finding. Knowing that my actions had contributed to her freedom brought me a quiet sense of fulfillment. And though I rarely thought of James anymore, when I did, it was with a sense of closure. He was a reminder of the darkness we all have the power to overcome. His choices had caused pain, but they had also shown me, and Precious, that we were stronger than we realized. I hope my story inspires you to find your voice. No matter how intimidating the situation, no matter how hopeless it may seem, remember that speaking the truth is an act of courage. It's a step toward justice, healing, and the light that lies beyond the darkness. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Subscribe today and join a community that values honesty, courage, and strength in the face of adversity. Until we meet again in my next story, goodbye.